Morning, guys. I'm just about ready to get started. This is going to be a quick mini lecture on, I believe it's chapter 5 or 6 in your textbook. I don't have that with me right now. So just a disclaimer before I get started. I do this before every mini Zoom lecture. I'm going to do my best to cover as much material as possible on this chapter of the skin, both today and I'm just admitting more students here, both today and our next mini lecture. That doesn't mean that you should rely completely on these mini lectures in order to do your studying. So I try to get to as much stuff as possible. I can't possibly sit here and read every word of the chapter of the book to you. So I hit on all of the main topics that I think are most important, and I go into as much detail as I have time to do, but I can't possibly mention every last detail in these mini lectures. So having said that, let's get started with this is our first organ system, actually. It's called the integumentary system. And so you and I always just say the skin, that's the common name for it, but it's truly an organ system that includes, the integumentary system includes the skin, hair, nails, and glands of the body, glands in the integumentary system. So when you hear that word integumentary system, know that it truly is an organ system, and it includes more than just the skin. The skin's the biggest part of it, but it includes skin, hair, nails, and glands. So without further ado, I'm going to share a screen here, get onto the first whiteboard. And I'm gonna write integumentary system just to remind you that this whole chapter is about integumentary system. But most of today's talk is going to be regarding the skin, which is the biggest part of it. So first and foremost, the skin has two major layers. You've heard this, I know that you've heard these terms before, but we're going to examine them in great detail. The two major layers of the skin are the epidermis and the dermis. That's D-E-R-M-I-S. Sorry about the poor writing. First and foremost, I want you to get a physical, visual idea of what the physical skin is like. So the epidermis consists of 5 layers, and the dermis consists of 2 layers. Here's the confusing part when you think 5 layers, 2 layers. Oh, most people think the epidermis must be thicker, automatically thicker than the dermis. That's not true at all. The 5 layers of the epidermis together are much thinner than the 2 layers of the dermis. So just to give you context, if we were to look at a piece of skin under a microscope at very low power, it would look something like this. We'd have, there's the surface of the skin, and then we'd see this wavy line, something like this. And then we'd see some sort of sparse looking connective tissue under here, and then some more densely packed tissue down here. Just to give you a real context, the 5 layers of the epidermis are all contained right here. All 5 layers are in this blue region. The 2 layers of the dermis are here and here. So you can see the dermal layers, even though there's only 2 of them, when you look relative to the thickness of the skin, they make up much more of the skin's thickness. So always keep that in mind. All 5 layers of the epidermis are really quite thin compared to the 2 layers of the dermis. All right, so now I'm going to move on and we're going to examine these 5 layers individually, and we're going to examine these 2 layers individually as well. So I'm going to hit my next whiteboard, get my black pen back. So the epidermis has 5 layers in it. First, I'm going to just mention the living cells that we find in these 5 layers of the epidermis. They're not, all of these cells are not found in all 5 layers. They're in different places. So I'm just going to put living cell types that are found within, somewhere within those 5 layers of the epidermis. First cell type are called keratinocytes. These are probably the most prevalent cell type, living cell type in the epidermis. So they outnumber the other cell types that I'm going to mention. These cells get their name because they produce keratin. Keratin is a very tough fibrous protein. So it sort of gives our skin its toughness, and it's fibrous protein that is made in these cells hardens those cells. So I'm going to put, these are most abundant cell type found in the epidermal layers. We also, I'm going to put under keratinocytes this term basal stem cells. These are stem cells found in the deepest layers of the epidermis that give rise to keratinocytes. So stem cells are just continually dividing cells in the human body, and they give rise to daughter cells of all different types. But in this case, these basal stem cells give rise to keratinocytes. It's where the keratinocytes come from. If I have time, I'll describe to you how the cells, where they arise and how they rise up to the surface of the skin. Next cell type in the epidermis are melanocytes. These are also found in the deepest layers of the epidermis. They synthesize a pigment called melanin. Melanin is a dark pigment that gives it's one of the factors that gives our skin its color. We all have different skin colors, largely based on how much melanin our melanocytes produce. So people who have fairer skin, paler skin, we all have roughly the same number of melanocytes, excuse me, in our skin. What gives us different skin pigments is how active these melanocytes are. I'll talk about how and why they produce the pigment melanin perhaps a little bit later. But just so you know, we all have the same number, relative same number of melanocytes in our skin, independent of our skin color. What helps give us that skin color is how active those melanocytes are. This pigment that is produced actually protects the living cells in our epidermis. So what happens is these melanocytes, it's activated by UV light from the sun. When UV light hits them, they secrete or produce this pigment melanin, and melanin accumulates in these granular structures called melanosomes. And those melanosomes, which are just these little granules that are filled with melanin, they sort of ooze around the deepest layers of our epidermis, and they protect cells. They also make their way into keratinocytes and help protect them as well. So the last thing I'm going to say here hopefully I'll have time to get to the nitty-gritty of this, but they are activated. These melanocytes are activated by UV light, ultraviolet light from the sun. Next cell type are dendritic cells. These are actually produced in the bone marrow like blood cells are and like other immune cells. Dendritic cells, they are created or produced in the bone marrow, and then they migrate out of the bone marrow to the superficial layers of our skin, and they behave like immune cells. How they behave like immune cells is they are called antigen presenting cells. When you study the immune system, you'll get into the details of that. In 20 seconds, I'll tell you what that means. Antigen presenting cells just means these dendritic cells, they're spiky on the ends. And when a foreign microorganism penetrates our skin, like bacteria, these cells can grab foreign microorganisms, literally attach to them, and drag them off to a lymph node or another immune site so that it helps activate our immune system. That's why they're called presenting cells. They grab foreign cells and haul them off to a lymph node and present them to something like a T lymphocyte. Finally, in the epidermis, we have tactile, I'm going to put this in quotes, Merkel cells, M-E-R-K-E-L. Merkel cells, tactile means touch. So these are basically cells that are connected to a sensory nerve. A sensory nerve ending, and they detect touch, sense of touch. All right, that's just a short laundry list of different cell types we find in the epidermis. Now I'm going to go through the 5 layers of the epidermis. So we're still talking about the epidermis. All right, 5 layers. Remember, I'm just talking about the epidermis. All 5 layers are found in this thin covering of our skin up here. So I'm going to explode that or magnify that diagram and give you an idea of how these 5 layers sit. So let's do that. Let me get my eraser out, and I'm going to magnify this. So if this is the upper layer of the epidermis, here's that wavy line way down here. And by the way, this wavy line separates epidermis from those 2 dermal layers. So everything below that blue wavy line is dermis, everything above it is epidermis. When we number the layers of the epidermis, they go like this. They start down here, deep, and they go 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The first layer is called, the deepest layer of the epidermis is called the stratum basale. I'll talk about that. Above that is the stratum spinosum. Above that is the stratum granulosum. Now, layer 4 is only found in certain places on the body. It's not found everywhere. It's called the stratum lucidum. And when I briefly talk about that, it's only found in what we call thick skin, which is the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. But layers 1, 2, 3, and 5 are found everywhere. Layer 5 is called the stratum corneum. So there are the 5 layer names. Now I'm going to individually briefly talk about each layer. And the first one's going to be this. I'm going to go by this number diagram. I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in that order. So epidermal layers, I'm just going to write stratum basal. This is the deepest layer of the epidermis, not the deepest layer of the skin, just the epidermis. There are basically 2 cell types, and they are basal stem cells and melanocytes. Now we know what these cells do from our previous discussion. So in this deepest layer of the skin, of the epidermis, it's only about 1 cell layer thick. So it's really quite thin. Along that wavy layer down here, we have stem cells. I'm going to draw them open, sort of white colored. And then we also have interspersed about, roughly 15 to 25%. So about 20% of the cells in this layer are melanocytes. And because they secrete a dark pigment, I'm going to color those in. So the white cells represent stem cells, basal stem cells. The melanocytes represent, or the dark cells represent the melanocytes. The basal stem cells are stem cells, so they're constantly dividing, mitotically dividing and giving off new cells. So I'm drawing little arrows. So these stem cells are constantly producing new cells. So our skin, every minute of every day, is constantly producing new skins from deep down here, our deep epidermal layer. And as these stem cells divide and make new cells, they push the older cells up toward the surface of our skin. And as they go upward, they change, they flatten, they lose their life, believe it or not. These are all dead cells by the time we get up here. But that's sort of the progression. And this constant cell production down here pushes the older cells upward, and eventually they slough off the top of our skin up here. The melanocytes, when UV light, so I'm going to draw a sun, when UV light from the sun penetrates our epidermal skin, and it penetrates down to these melanocytes, they produce this pigment called melanin that helps, it sort of oozes out of these melanocytes. It helps protect these basal stem cells. It protects the melanocytes themselves. It also enters this pigment. Here's a new keratinocyte being produced by a basal stem cell. I'm going to draw a big one. This pigment, this dark pigment that's secreted from sunlight activation, can enter this cell and actually coat it on the sunny side of the cell like this. So melanocytes produce melanin. That's a pigment that it's all for protection. It protects the basal stem cells, the melanocytes, and these baby keratinocytes that are being produced by the basal stem cells. So that's layer 1. Now I'm going to go on to layer 2, which is the stratum spinosum. So just above the stratum basal, let me draw my line down here again. Here's the stem cells. There's a melanocyte. It's a very thin layer. It's only 1 cell layer thick. The stratum spinosum is the next layer moving toward the surface, and it's several cell layers thick. Depending on where on the body and the individual, it can be up to, say, 20 cell layers thick or more. So we get a much thicker layer here. The cells are still living. So I'm going to write still alive. And I'm going to put the cells are still dividing in this area. It gets its name spinosum because the cells appear as though they have these spikes coming out of them like this. When you look at them under high microscopy, they look spiny or spiky. That's where the name spinosum comes from. That starts to help interlock these cells together to provide tighter junctions in these cells. The main functions or the main characteristics to remember about this layer is that it's anywhere from 15 to 25 cell layers thick. Cells are still living, still dividing. Then we're going to get up to layer number 3. I can do that on this same picture. I'll use a different color. I'll just use red. There's a thin layer now of cells above the spinosum. It's 1 to 5 cell layers thick. It's called the stratum granulosum. I'm going to write 1 to 5 cell layers. So it just gives you an idea. This first layer down here is very thin, one layer thick, 1 cell layer thick. Second layer is fairly thick, and then the third layer is quite thin again. Not quite as thin as the stratum basale, but almost. The stratum granulosum gets its name because the cells in this layer produce 2 different types of granules. The granules that are produced by the cells in this layer are called keratohyalin granules. And what these do is they massively produce the protein keratin, that tough fibrous protein. I'm just going to draw an arrow and write keratin. By the way, all those products that are advertised as having keratin in them or adding keratin to toughen your hair and all that stuff, really that's basically a bunch of snake oil. Keratin has to be produced from within the cell itself in order for it to be part of the cell. You can't just put it all over your hair or your skin and expect it to be absorbed by those cells. It has to be produced from within the cell. So these granules actually produce keratin to give our cells their toughness. They also help knit those cells together tightly. The other type of granule that's produced are called lamellar granules, which secrete a glycolipid Glyco means sugar, lipid means fat. So it's a combination of a sugary fat that really gives our skin its waterproofing abilities. So I'm just going to write waterproof. So those lamellar granules are largely what give our skin its waterproofing ability. Well, last thing I'm going to say about layer 3 is that the cells, by and large, are no longer living once they reach this level. So I'm going to write cells are dead. It's supposed to be an @ sign at this layer. Now I'm going to go on to layers 4 and 5. Layer 4 is the stratum lucidum. We only find this layer, that's lucidum. We only find this layer in thick skin. hard for me to write at the top of this iPad because it's vertical to me right now, and every time I touch it, it moves. So we only find this in thick skin. And that would be the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. It's a super thin layer that's clear. So I'm just going to write thin, clear layer. It sits right on top of that layer number 3, the granulosum. And its function is really sort of hypothesized. It's not super well known. Most dermatologists/scientists think that it's used almost like a glue to help glue down the final and 5th layer, especially in thick skin areas of the body. So layer number 5, the final top layer, is called the stratum corneum. corneum. This is the thickest layer of the epidermis, not the thickest layer of the skin, just of those 5 layers of the epidermis. It can be anywhere from 25 to 35 to 40 cell layers thick. So I'm just going to write 20 to 35 cell layers. It's the outermost layer. We are constantly losing this layer of skin. Millions of cells come off of our body every day. And it's the basal stem cells down in the stratum basal that are constantly cranking out new cells that help replace the layers that slough off on a daily basis. All of the cells are dead, highly keratinized keratinocytes by this stage. They are tightly knitted together. So I'm just going to write tight cell junctions for protection and somewhat waterproofing as well. But our main waterproofing layer is that granulosum layer. So don't get that confused, please. So the cells, by the time they get to the top, are tightly knitted together, mostly for protection, by these cellular junctions called desmosomes that are super tight. The cells are all dead. They're full of keratin, that tough fibrous protein. And that gets us through the 5 layers of the epidermis. Now I'm going to hit the 2 layers of the dermis. And just so you know, when I label these layers number 1 and 2, just to give you context, here's that wavy line. And remember, our 5 layers of the epidermis went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now the 2 layers of the dermis are going to go, they're going to start at the same place here and go 1, 2. So we start at this same line again. Rather than going up toward the surface of the skin, we're going to number them going deeper. So that's number 1, and then deep to that will be number 2, okay? So 2 layers of the dermis. Layer number 1 is called the papillary dermis. Papilla means nipple. So at this wavy line, when the first scientists looked at this skin under a microscope, they gave these raised mounds the name papilla. That's why it's called papillary dermis. It's mostly made up of areolar connective tissue, which we learned about in our connective tissue unit. That is some fibrous connective tissue that has cells interspersed in it like this. It's also, there are areas that are highly vascularized. Before I go any further, I need to say this. All layers of the epidermis, those 5 layers that we just studied, are completely avascular. That means there's no direct blood supply to any 5 layers. Okay, so all layers of the epidermis are avascular. That brings significance to the papillary dermis being highly vascular. So there's lots of blood vessels meandering in this area. That helps provide nutrition to the deepest layers. I'm trying to write too quickly. To the deep layers of the epidermis. So those basal stem cells and those melanocytes and those living cells down in the stratum basale and the stratum spinosum, they get their nutrition from the vascularization in the papillary dermis. We also find immune cells in the papillary dermis. It's really quite common. Immune cells, things like macrophages, are supposed to be an A there, that help devour bad things that get into our skin. So the highly vascularized blood vessels provide nutrition to the deepest layers of the epidermis. And finally, the last function of this layer is to help secure superficial layers to deep layers. All right, so here's that wavy line again. There's areolar connective tissue in this area. It's full of blood vessels, immune cells, and I'm just going to draw some living cells in this area. And it really helps bind these layers. This wavy line serves to increase surface area and really help bind those layers of epidermis to deeper layers. If it was just a straight line like this, when we were bumped or scraped, physical damage, this would easily peel off the 5 layers of the epidermis. This sort of tooth-like boundary helps really grip those upper layers of the epidermis to deeper layers of the skin. So that's layer number 1. Now I'm going to do the second layer of the dermis, layer 2, which is called reticular dermis. Reticular dermis, first and foremost, is the deepest layer of the skin. It is made predominantly of dense, irregular connective tissue. It's also highly vascularized. It really helps knit and anchor our skin to the deeper connective tissue below it. So this super deep layer of the skin, by the way, it makes up about 80% skin volume. So it's by far the thickest layer. And it's full of very tough collagen protein fibers. Those collagen fibers tend to run parallel to the surface of the body. There are separations in these bundles of fibers that are actually called cleavage or tension lines. So if you were to peel away the epidermis from your skin, there are actually patterns to the organization, particularly of the reticular dermis, and cleavage lines are thin areas of reticular dermis that sort of run in a pattern around the body. And I don't have time to draw the entire thing, but if you were to really peel away the skin from an individual, I'm just drawing a human torso, you would see these sort of patterned lines in the dermal layers of the skin. Up here would be circular in the cervical neck region. And those lines are thinning of these collagen fiber bundles within the reticular dermis. And there's not a lot of significance to that other than it helps with mobility, with movement of our appendages. It also assists surgeons sometimes when they have to cut through layers of muscle and tissue. Surgeons tend to try to find, they know where these cleavage lines are, and they tend to cut the body on those lines when they go in for a surgical procedure. Just checking my notes to make sure that I've covered everything that I want to say about the dermis. This papillary to epidermal sort of boundary that we've talked about, this really helps produce sort of ridges it's more complicated than what I'm describing right now, but dermal ridges are produced in part by these papillary mounds. And it starts with the tissue down here in the papillary dermis, and it helps produce the ridges on top of our skin, particularly in thick skin areas that give us our fingerprints and gripping power. So the fingerprints that we find on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet aren't just there for design or for aesthetic purposes. Those dermal ridges that start down here in the dermis and end up protruding on the surface of our skin, particularly on the palms and soles, they really help with gripping power, just like the tread on the tire on the road. So when you go to grip something, those ridges actually serve a gripping function. All right. Really quickly, I did want to go through the process of how the skin produces, how those melanocytes produce melanin. So quick tutorial on that. All right, skin exposure to UV light. First, before we go any further, the skin exposure to UV light is the #1 cause for skin cancers. So the sort of paradox about sunlight is we need sunlight in order to produce vitamin D. It's actually produced, the precursor to vitamin D is produced in our skin only when sunlight hits it. So it's a requirement. We have to have some sunlight hitting our skin, but obviously too much exposure is what causes cancer. Here's the process of what happens when UV light hits the skin. So UV light is produced by the sun. What it does is it photolyzes provitamin D3 that's found in the skin. So this is in the skin, and that gets photolyzed to previtamin D3. That's the first step that happens. This has a name called cholecalciferol. So when UV light hits our skin, this reaction occurs to produce cholecalciferol. It's steroid-based from cholesterol. That's where it gets its name at the end, iferol. So cholesterol that's actually in the layers of our skin gets converted to this product called cholecalciferol, and this then enters our bloodstream. I'm just going to write enters blood. So after UV light does this conversion process to synthesize cholecalciferol, that then enters our circulation, and then it travels to the kidneys, where this cholecalciferol gets converted to calcitriol. So in the kidneys, cholecalciferol gets converted to calcitriol. This is what you and I call vitamin D. This is the active form. Vitamin D. And vitamin D is really just, it's a hormone. It's a steroid-based hormone. It's not really a vitamin. The reason we call it a vitamin is because it's essential to the human body. So it's a cholesterol-based hormone, really. It's okay if you call it a vitamin. Everybody else does. This, what it does is it enhances. Why do we have to have vitamin D? Because it enhances the absorption of calcium in the small intestine. So one of the essential functions of the skin is to produce what we call vitamin D. But this is the real pathway. When sunlight hits our skin, it produces this vitamin D precursor called cholecalciferol. That then travels to the kidneys, where it gets converted to the active form of vitamin D, calcitriol. Its function, calcitriol, active vitamin D, is to enhance the absorption of calcium in the small intestine. We don't make calcium in the body. We have to ingest it. Calcium is used for a million things in the body. And in order we can eat calcium all day, but if we don't make enough vitamin D, we can't absorb that into our body. So without sunlight, we can't absorb calcium in our diet. And it's vitamin D that enables us to absorb it. So that's the significance of vitamin D. The last thing I'm going to do before we cut this off is I'm going to draw for you a diagram of a hair follicle. And I'm losing, I think I only have 10 boards. No, here's a new one. So I'm going to draw a hair follicle for you and label the parts to it. This is the surface of the skin. The term hair follicle really refers to this cavity that a hair grows in. So I'm drawing the hair follicle right now. It penetrates the follicle deep down into the skin. So here's our wavy line. The 5 layers of the epidermis are above this line. There's a cross section of the skin. So we have 5 layers of epidermis in here. Then we've got 2 layers of dermis. I'm going to use a different color. There would be papillary dermis close to the epidermal layers, and then reticular dermis would be most of this thickness. So if you were to look at a hair follicle, if we were live, I would have you look at a hair follicle under a microscope, and this is kind of what you would see. So just to remind you, we've got 5 layers of epi, 2 layers of dermis here and here. Now you can see that I drew epidermal tissue surrounding this hair follicle. That's because epidermal tissue goes down and surrounds this follicle. That is called the epidermal sheath. So even though the whole hair follicle penetrates deep down into the reticular dermis, it's encased in this epidermal tissue. So what surrounds it is epidermal tissue, even though it penetrates way down deep into here. The reason I left this bit open right here is there's a tiny piece of dermal tissue that penetrates up into the hair follicle at the base of it, like this. That's called the dermal papilla. So let me label that. You know what? I'm going to make my line. The dermal papilla technically is the red part here. Now the hair itself grows like this. It grows, its growth part is down here at the base of the follicle. And then, as you know, it goes up, penetrates out of our skin like this. So now I'm drawing the actual hair. And there's 3 portions to the longitudinal section of this hair. We call this the hair bulb down here because of its shape. We call this the hair root. And we call this the hair shaft, the part that you and I can see that penetrates out of the body. Now, just like in the stratum basale, there's an area of this hair follicle way down at the base of the bulb where it meets the dermal papilla, where there's a lot of activity. That's where new cellular growth is. I'm going to try to use a different color. So I'll use yellow. This area right here is called the hair matrix. And what's such a big deal about the hair matrix is that is where we get new cellular growth. So there's stem cells here, just like in the stratum basale. So I'm going to write new cell growth, in parentheses, mitosis. So we get mitotic cellular division of new cells. So there's stem cells there. And guess what? They're just cranking out new cells all the time, just like in the skin. So these cells are living, these new hair cells, also interspersed, just like in the skin, there are melanocytes in the hair matrix as well. So the hair matrix contains stem cells and melanocytes. The melanocytes help give our hair its color by how much pigment is secreted or not secreted. So blonde hairs would have less melanin in them than dark hairs. So all of the living business is going down near the hair matrix. These cells, just like in the skin, they quickly die, these hair cells, as they get pushed upward. And as they get pushed upward, just like skin cells, they accumulate keratin, that tough fibrous protein, so that by the time the cells are where I'm drawing right now, they are dead. They're no longer living. Certainly up here, the cells have been dead for a long time. In this dermal papilla region, we have a blood supply, so it's vascular. You know that because it's reticular dermis. And there are nerve endings. The cells in this area up here are dead, and there are no nerve endings. That's why it doesn't hurt at all when we cut our hair. We feel nothing. But you know that if somebody pulls your hair, it's painful. And that's because when you yank on a hair, it's pulling it from this area down here. And there are nerve endings and blood vessels in that area that help supply nutrition. There are pain receptors as well, which are those nerve endings right here that cause pain when it gets stimulated. Now I need to clean up my drawing a little bit so that I can add a couple more features to this hair follicle. So let me just bring out my eraser. On this side of the hair follicle, I'm going to attach a gland that empties into the follicle space. This is called a sebaceous gland. Because it secretes a product called sebum. This is an oil-based secretion. It's lipid-based, fat-based, oil-based, that the cells down here in the gland secrete this stuff, and it enters the duct, and it sort of bathes the hair follicle with an oily substance, as well as the surface of the skin around the hair follicle. So this oil-based sebum, its real function is to protect and moisturize the hair and the hair follicle and the surface of the skin around it, which is kind of ironic because we spend every day scrubbing all of this oil off of our skin, only then to put a bunch of lotions and creams and moisturizers back on our skin to do what this sebum oil was designed to do in the first place. The last thing I'm going to say about this gland, first, these sebaceous glands are associated with every hair follicle on the human body. We have roughly 2 million hair follicles all over our bodies, and we have sebaceous glands associated with these follicles. They're in really high density in certain areas of the body, the face, the chest, a little bit on the back, more so in the axillary region, the armpit region, and the groin region where we grow pubic hair. Those are the major concentrations that we find these glands. They can exist without a hair follicle, especially in high density areas like the face and the chest, but typically they're associated with hair follicles. They are holocrine in nature. We learned this term in our last unit. That means that the secretions, when they secrete the sebum, the cells, the secretory cells explode and they're damaged in the process and they have to be rejuvenated. We need to make new secretory cells after secretion. The other structure that I wanted to draw, so I'm going to get out my eraser, I'll do it on this side, also associated with every single hair follicle is a small, smooth muscle. So what I'm drawing now is a muscle that's associated with the wall of the hair follicle here and the epidermis here on two ends of its connection points. This is called an erector pili, P-I-L-I, muscle. It is a smooth muscle, which means we do not have conscious control over the contractions. What this muscle does, and like I said, we have an erector pili muscle associated with every single hair on the surface of our body. When it contracts, it causes the hair to stand up on end. So when it's relaxed, when the muscle is not contracted, our hairs tend to be sort of lying down like this. And then when this muscle contracts, it causes the hair to stand upward. When you get goosebumps and you go outside and you're cold, this muscle gets activated. If you've ever been really frightened and you feel hair stand up like on the back of your neck, that's also an autonomic nervous response that contracts all of those muscles. We see it more often in animals like cats and dogs when they're threatened and their hair stands up on their backs. That's also an autonomic nervous response. What it is that erector pili muscle is contracting and causing those hairs to stand up. That's sort of a threatened aggression type of behavior in those animals. The cross section of this hair where I've cut it right here, I'm going to draw that real quickly and then I'll end this mini lecture. If we were to take that hair and cut it and look at it in cross section, there is a center of the hair called the medulla. M-E-D-U-L-L-A. That is sort of soft keratin pigmented cells. That's where a lot of the color of our hair is found. Some keratinized cells, but it's sort of a soft, mushy center. Then the second layer out here that I'm drawing around the medulla is actually called the cortex. And it's supposed to be the thickest portion of the hair. So I'm going to label that. I'm just going to write cortex in parentheses, thick. That's the largest volume to the hair itself. And finally, the outer region, which I've exaggerated, it's not nearly this thick, is called the cuticle. The cuticle is super thin. It's a single layer of keratinized cells, and it's the toughest layer. So I'm just going to write thin and tough. All right, guys, I'm going to cut off my recording here.